we have to take folks' social and structural determinants of health into account when we think about their lives, that it's not just somebody's HIV health, it's not just someone's housing status, it's not just someone's risk for diabetes or hypertension, that this has to be whole person health in wherever someone's accessing medical care. No one is one thing when they move through the world. And I think what's really exciting, and I think we owe a lot to the HIV community, that has been propelled into the conversation, and really, I think thanks to academics, thanks to folks that are largely in HIV research, that's been confirmed in the data, confirmed through lived experience. And I think we owe a lot to that. And then, seeing then care systems stood up and supported by that.
Like, no one is just one thing. We exist in these interconnected, interdimensional beings.
We are on part 2 of a 3-parter for World AIDS Day.
It's a 2-parter.
Is it 2-parter?
It's a 2-parter.
Oh, wow.
We're on part 2 of a 2-part episode. So welcome back.
Welcome back.
And happy World AIDS Day to you.
Remember and commit. You're 35.
We are remembering and committing to the fight and the celebration of life. So in the last episode, we spent a lot of time talking about prevention and prevention modalities. And I think it's important to understand where we've come from and to also acknowledge a lot of long-term survivors. Unfortunately, Jose had to leave us for this episode. So we'll continue with Dr. Tracie Gilbert and also Caitlin Conyngham. I just was pulling up some of the statistics and figures from the HIV pandemic. 1981, the first case was discovered. 1983, it was identified as HIV by researchers in France. 1985, there was a first test developed. 1987, there was AZT. It became the first antiretroviral drug. The 90s introduced antiretroviral therapy. And then in 1994, we learned that AZT was able to reduce mother-to-child transmission. And then came the big breakthrough in 1996 with what we refer to as HAART, or highly active antiretroviral therapy. And that really marked a turning point. I think in the United States, there's a lot of global advancements, but in the United States, you can look at 2 factors on the timeline. You can look at PrEP in 2012 with the FDA approval, and you can look at 1997 when HAART became available and people started to live, right? So I'm interested in hearing your reflections on just the evolution of our thought and our consciousness on HIV and AIDS after antiretroviral medications.
I'll let you take this one. Yeah. So I only know a world in which HIV exists, my age, right? And I only remember a time consciously where single tablet regimens and ART exist. That I did not have a consciousness to a time before that, right? So I think I'm very cognizant of that and the way in which I kind of situate my experience and I think in some cases both the realities of how we come to these advancements with my optimism and my kind of excitement of where we're at, and the realities that has not been the case, right? Talking to folks in this work who said there were times that I just didn't get tested because there was no option, right? There was nothing to do if you got tested. That's not the case today, right? And so I think that I'm very cognizant of that reality, and I think that to be in a place today where we have really effective medications that for most people are one drug once a day. For some people, it can be an injection that's even less frequently, is amazing. That's not everybody's reality. It's not everybody's experience of living with HIV. And I think that is and has clouded what people's kind of current understanding of HIV even is. I think you ask a random person, if I go call up my mom, it took me a very long time to convince my mom, a rural white lady in middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, that HIV wasn't the kind of alarm clock, multi-pill, story that she saw on like NBC News in the 80s, right? And I think that's many people's current reality of HIV. That's not the case. And so I think, not only are we kind of contending with these amazing scientific advancements, but like undoing neglect and the lack of access to effective treatments that really devastated many generations. And so I think that is perhaps a non-answer, but that's kind of where I sit with that. I would we're giving everybody friendly amendments today. I think syringe service programs and harm reduction is another huge component that has revolutionized the way we think about providing access to tools that disrupt transmission of HIV as well. And I think no better place than, and I wish Jose was here because what a guy to fight for syringe services in Philadelphia, and the health department in 1992 was a core leader in that. Philadelphia saw that better than anyone. Having access to sterile injection equipment saves lives and prevents the spread of infectious diseases.
So Tracie, I'm going to ask the same question to you, but in a slightly different way, because I think that, how has medication and the availability of medication changed the way people connect with one another?
Yeah. I was actually, if I could, I might even want to amend your question a little bit more because I was thinking about it. This is where I'm going to bring in the academics, right? Because I think what the just technology, what advancements in technology have allowed us to do in the academy, at least, is shift the conversation around HIV and AIDS, right? Whereas back in the 90s and the 80s, there was more of a focus on like keeping people alive and dealing with the very real issue of people dying and people needing to know about transmission and all of these things so they can stay alive. I think the advancements that we've seen have allowed us to be able to broaden the conversation and talk about the other factors that play a part in the perpetuation of HIV. So stigma, so all the intersections we talked about, racism, homophobia, the bringing in to talk about the legal pieces, having conversations about poverty and the roles of poverty and the roles of policy and how that helps perpetuate harm against folks who are living with the disease. And so I think from an intellectual standpoint, that the advancements they've provided immediate support for folks, but then for the larger society, it's allowed us to have, again, that more nuanced conversation about the pieces that allow these things to continue to go on. Even thinking about, I know y'all keep bringing up me saying this, but what I brought up in the last conversation.
Plug that episode, baby. If y'all ain't click this link right here and watch her damn episode.
It's true.
Yeah,
I think
it was a good episode.
You have to be your own advocate, though.
It was a good
Get
episode.
it, Dr. Tracie, advocating her own episode.
I said it before.
Go ahead.
Every time she says that, just to go back as the think bubble.
But it also, especially in Black and Brown communities, it opens up space to talk about HIV as being part of the variety of health concerns that you deal with as a function of being in these bodies in this country.
Bless you, Dylan.
And so, I think there's this indirect, I would even argue, benefit that has been provided us to be able to say, yeah, just because people are healed doesn't mean there aren't other conversations that we need to be having.
Do you think it's easier to have these? This is totally not on the list, but do you think it's easier for people to have conversations openly about status and about HIV and STIs than it is to have it in an intimate conversation?
Ooh. I think it's more easier. Do I think it's easy? Probably not.
Yeah.
I think it's easier than it was even as much as 10 years ago.
Let me wrap my head around the understanding. So you're asking, because there's medication and we know what we know now, does that contribute to it being a little bit easier to have this conversation?
To have conversations, because, like, it's easy to say, I know for me, it's easy to say, girl, I'm HIV positive, because we're like here, and it's like, okay, but when it's an intimate setting, sometimes it'd be like, because, you know, people who have HIV, where you just, like, switch it up, like, do you think it's easier now that for people to have, because it used to be large conversations to say, hey, I have HIV, it's more scary now than, so do you think it's a reverse, or do you think it's the same?
I think it depends.
Okay.
I think it depends. I think it's easier among folks for whom sex is easier, an easier conversation, right? And I think, I mean, we haven't even talked about the fact that sex is still, by and large, a very tough conversation for many people to have, whether they have HIV or not. And so I think in those spaces where people are more open and they're more positive and they're more queer aware and they're more just open-minded, yeah, the conversation's easier. And yet we still know that there are still some people who are like, I told my man I want him to spank me, right? And they feel that sense of like,
not on this podcast.
Right, not on this
podcast.
podcast.
On this podcast, we proudly ask to be spanked.
Amen. But you know, so I think it's from what I see, I think it's connected to that. So in those spaces, yeah, folks are more willing and open, even to share things outside of HIV. So sharing that they may have a herpes diagnosis, or sharing that they're polyamorous, or sharing all of these other things. Yeah, in those spaces, absolutely. So.
Caitlin is wanting to get in on this. Go ahead. Caitlin's like, is it my turn? May I contribute?
I have another question for you, Caitlin.
Oh, well, should I
go
skip
ahead,
ahead?
No, go ahead.
No, I think I really wanted to kind of, well, I can't decide if I want to talk about this or jump back to your thing, but I think going...
It's a podcast.
So does that mean it's lawlessness?
Yes.
So I think kind of to your point earlier, though, about expanding these conversations about these social and structural factors, I think, you know, to one point, the academy, but I think, you know, and again, shout out to our previous guest on the previous episode, Jose, you know, core to a lot of the shifts we've seen in funding, I think in a lot of the ways we're seeing these conversations at the forefront, it is because of HIV activists who really at the beginning of the epidemic demanded that folks' lives be taken into account in their treatment, that we're having these conversations, that they came into the academy, that, you know, I think we're seeing now in ending the HIV epidemic, you know, and we, you know, again, perhaps it's for a different episode, that we have to take folks' social and structural determinants of health into account when we think about their lives, that it's not just somebody's HIV health. It's not just someone's housing status. It's not just someone's risk for diabetes or hypertension, that this has to be whole person health in wherever someone's accessing medical care. Because, you know, no one is one thing when they move through the world. And I think what's really exciting, and I think we owe a lot to the HIV community or communities of folks who are historically folks living with HIV, that has been propelled into the conversation. And really, I think thanks to academics, thanks to folks that are largely in HIV research, that's been, again, you know, confirmed in the data, confirmed through lived experience. And I think we owe a lot to that. And then, you know, seeing then care systems stood up and supported by that.
I just wanted you to take a breath because you gave us such good sound bites. I'm like, no, can we cut here? No, can we cut here? No, can we cut here?
Sorry.
Like everything, like no one is just one thing. We
Yes.
exist in these interconnected, interdimensional beings.
I'll breathe next time.
How do you what would you tell someone who is looking for care? And they're going into, and we were just kind of having this conversation off camera before we started, of like when people go into a doctor's office or their provider's office and they're asking for things and they get a pushback that it may not be something that absolutely may be right. As I was saying, I have some female friends who are cisgender, who actually do want to be on PrEP, who have taken the time to look up what PrEP is and then are still denied PrEP because they're not qualified. What is your take? And then please follow up. Like, what is your take on how you advocate for yourself? And we can even like stick into women right now of, how do you advocate for things, especially when it comes to preventative cares for yourself? How do you stand in that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy. I mean, regardless of who you are, what you're doing, advocating for yourself in 2023 is hard, I think. And then when you overlay all the complexities of race, class, gender, it becomes perhaps more difficult, or it doesn't perhaps become more difficult. It does become more difficult. And so I think, the first thing that I would encourage anyone is to kind of think about what you want. Think about, who makes you feel comfortable, and try to find that in a provider. I think everyone deserves a provider that listens to you. Everyone deserves a provider that, really helps you think about what your next step is. And that step is, what you really see in your healthcare. And that can be whether it's related to HIV care, or, we've talked about diabetes care or prevention care, and that makes you feel good when you go to the doctor's office. I think, we talked a little bit earlier about Dr. Brady, but I think one of the things that's really impactful from my time at the
Dr. Brady, my boss.
Yeah, sorry.
My
time at the health department was, she often used to use this question: how well do you feel like your healthcare provider knows you as a person? Mm-hmm. Right? And I think that's always stuck with me in my own care. Again, I think I mentioned this, like, I see a lot of doctors. And the ones that don't know me as a person, I don't connect with them. I don't really feel like they know my spouse. They don't return my little messages as quickly. And they don't, when I need something, I don't think they understand the complexity of what I'm asking. So I think that's a good litmus test of kind of, who are you going to see? And I think it's okay to change care providers if you don't feel like you're getting what you need. Yeah. And that's okay. So I think, have a good understanding. There are great resources. Shout out to the Philly Keep on Loving website. I love what y'all have done with all of the resources, the navigation. Have an understanding of what you deserve in your PrEP care. The first time I got prescribed PrEP, I went to the pharmacy and I got 7 pills. Mm-hmm. I don't know if anybody knows about PrEP, but you're not supposed to get 7 pills. You're supposed to take it once a day. So much to my surprise, when my healthcare provider at a large academic medical center in the city sent 7 pills, I thought, there's not enough drug in here for me to take 1 pill once a day to reduce my HIV risk. Mm-hmm. And I had to call them and say, you did something wrong. I don't have enough HIV prevention medication to take this. Mm-hmm. And they were an OBGYN, and she said, I don't know. This was what was in the EMR. And I said, you need to figure this out, because if I was any other person, I would not have picked this up. Yeah. And I think that's the thing, is folks can't be responsible for that, right? Mm-hmm. And so I would, if you have the capacity, if you have the bandwidth, do that. I'm constantly doing that in my own care pathway. But I think if you're a care provider, just ask folks how they're doing, what's going on in their lives. And I think that's an amazing segue to what people want and how they're going to show up in their care. I had a conversation with someone this week, and it started about why they came in, and it ended up with a conversation about her being very happy that she's alive after having 2 overdoses. We put the care on hold, like why she came in that day was very important. She got the care she needs. She saw her medical provider, but we ended up talking about the fact that she was really happy she showed up for herself. Mm-hmm. She attended her medical appointments, and that she was really glad that she could talk about how she was someone that survived 2 overdoses, and that's where she needed to be that day. Yeah. And I think if we have the capacity to support that, it's really beautiful.
Tracie, this year's theme by the CDC is Remember and Commit for HIV Awareness Week, and also for World AIDS Day. What does it look like for folks to commit?
He stole my question. I was trying to gear that question in my head.
I took it.
Sorry, I talked too much.
Well, I was actually prepared to add to the previous question because you're going to say to build. So now I'm thinking committing. Such a great question. I'm going to try to dovetail what I was about to say into this, because I think what I'm seeing at large is the imperative that all of us need to make to committing to ourselves. And that means unapologetic allegiance to the things that will help us be well, whatever that is. Understanding that the vast majority of us have been socialized in a way to put ourselves second, third, fourth, fifth, down the line. Whether that is to spouses, the government, doctors, whoever we deem as authority. And I think it's time out for that. And so I think, to me, commitment is really about the individual choices that we make to experience the best lives that we want to experience. And that includes our sexual health. So it is knowing what you need in order to be healthy and relentlessly pursuing that at every opportunity. So everything that Caitlin was saying about the advocacy work that happens with the medical provider, making it clear, like, no, this is not to discount your expertise or your knowledge as a medical professional, but is also to establish that this is my body, this is my health, and this is what I need. And being clear to say, I don't have a problem going elsewhere. I don't have a problem speaking up. If I have to release the fear and practice it with my friends, how do I say this thing? Or bringing in the paperwork and say, I'll share a story from my own life. I was having post-COVID a couple of years ago, I was having heart pains. And they put me in touch with a cardiologist. And if you know anything about fat phobia, the first thing every doctor wants to ask you about anything is how much do you weigh and how much weight you need to lose. And I was very clear that that was not the answer, because I didn't have this issue prior to now, and I've actually lost weight. So make it make sense. Mm-hmm. And I will say, and this is a privilege of mine, but I think anybody can operate with this sort of behavior. I think having a doctorate put me in a position where I felt like, okay, so let's talk peer to peer. Because you're not going to talk to me like I'm stupid, right? And yeah, it was a debate, but it was a respectful debate, because it's like, I'm not giving you just something that I thought of in the top of my head because I just felt like saying no to you. I'm giving you clear concerns, and I am going to trust that you're going to meet me from this place of respect. And that's something I think every single one of us has the right to do, regardless of our age, regardless of our health status, to go in spaces and say, I command that you treat me with dignity. And if you cannot do that, then I need to go to someone who will, or you need to refer to me to someone who will. And frankly,
I don't want your referral, because I don't know.
Well, true. Well, you can always vet, right? Like, give me the name. But I think there's a sobering that also has to happen with medical professionals of really admitting that this is practice. You do not have all the answers. And there are some people that you have been socialized to devalue. And if you don't unlearn that, then you are doing them a disservice. And so that's what I think of with commitment. The commitment we make to ourselves to say, I'm going to be well. I'm going to do what it takes to be well. And I'm going to prioritize what it is that I need.
What does it mean to remember?
To remember is to remember those we've lost, to remember what we're worth, to remember that there's always hope and a future if we want it.
Caitlin,
I wish we could end the episode on that word. We got so much more conversation to have. Go ahead.
Same questions. Commit to you.
Yeah, I think
I want to actually turn the question though.
Oh,
so commit to you in the work that you've done from January 1st, 2023 up until today. What has your commitment looked like?
Yeah, I think That's a great question. I've made a serious job change this year. And so I think for me, my commitment has been really reflecting on how I'm showing up every day. And, you know, it's really beautiful to hear you talk about that. I think the place I'm working at and really thinking about what my next move was really centered on finding a place that I could show up authentically as who I was. And that really centered on not only me wanting to go to a place that I could just be who I was every day, but first and foremost, a place that at its core commanded that members, folks that, we provide medical care, has at its center, like at its core, I think dignity and concierge care is deserved by everyone. And so I feel so grateful to have been able to make that choice this year and have found a place that is just the core tenet of how, we move through medicine. And, it feels really special that a place like that exists and that I can be a part of it. And so I think for me, a big commitment was upending my life and thinking, I need to do something differently because my values are not aligning with how I'm showing up at my job. And it's, to your point, it's exhausting me. It's taking a tax on my personal life, my professional life. And that shift has, I talked to Javontae the other day, it's changed how I show up for my coworkers. It's changed how I show up for myself, my spouse. And it's just incredible when you have an environment that, I don't want to use my baked in the cake analogy where
I promise I won't come for that one again.
I know, I'm a baker, I'm a femme chef, okay? But where at the core, folks have autonomy and that respect and dignity and choice is at the center of how we do our work. So I feel really grateful to have that. So that's really, I think, a core part of how I've committed. And then I think, I've really committed to share my own personal story differently. I think I've really come to terms with my own chronic illness, and that looks very different than HIV, but it's really impacted how I do my work. It's impacted my own engagement with our health system in Philadelphia. And I think for a while I felt a lot of shame around that. And I very recently was like, this is the same prison that keeps us not having conversations. And so I think I've committed a lot more with folks I work with members that I engage with, to just be really honest that we all have struggles and that we can come to a place of a lot of solidarity and beauty talking about that. So that's what I've got.
I want to jump in and ask this question because I've heard you use it several times throughout our talking today, but you use this phrase members, right? And so I'm assuming you're referring to people who come for services, what other folks might call patients. You're calling them members. And I love that small adjustment to language because, it shifts the conversations. It shifts the paradigm of how we think about what we're providing to people. Talk to me a little bit about language and this idea of language and the relationship to HIV and AIDS, right? Because we're even moving away from calling it AIDS and really adopting, a mantra of HIV and saying that it's not AIDS, right? Like unlinking the two. Give me your reflections on language.
I think language is so deeply powerful, both from a historical context, right? I think when we talk about AIDS, there's a deep history that I think in a lot of cases deserves to be acknowledged. There's a lot of stigma that comes with that. But, I think thinking very intentionally about how we use language can undo stigmas, create new narratives, and I think in a lot of ways co-create new pathways, right? there's a lot of power in language and a lot that we can do together when we reimagine language and we take language back into our, taking language back into our own hands is not a novel concept, right? I think marginalized communities have been doing that for a while. And I think, it would be, I think there's a lot we can learn from that and a lot that we can take in and say, sex is ubiquitous. I think there's many people, perhaps I'd venture to say that most people have some interaction with it. And what would it look like if we changed the language around sex and don't really like the word normalized it, but just kind of, the price of doing business is that we just have conversations about sex. And they're like, the same way that you talk about crossing the street safely when the lights flash, you kind of talk about what it is to, think about embodying yourself, standing up for yourself, articulating your desires so that you know what you want from your life. And I think that's where language and whether it's, shifting from STD to STI, from HIV, ACO, just the office that Javontae
just put my business out there.
Or
Go ahead.
they just had a huge name change, and I think it's incredibly meaningful that they changed the name from AIDS Activities Coordinating Office to the Division of HIV Health. And I think these are really impactful, big things.
Tracie was nodding about the language conversation because, and I'm just reflecting on your work, particularly what I know of your work in your dissertation about Black sexuality and how once upon a time, I would have been called a nigger. I would have been called a Negro. I would have been called colored, a person of color, which I don't understand, I don't understand how colored person is different from person of color, but that's my own prejudice. To a Black person, African American, right? BIPOC. BIPOC is a different episode because, I'm still trying to wrestle. That's a different episode. I'm not even going to go there. But BIPOC, right?
It's not one of my favorite ones, I will say.
Black indigenous people of color for folks who don't know, right? But comment on this language reflection.
Well, the first thing that popped in my head with this was, I don't know how many of your viewers listen to the Read podcast, but I quote.
My mama doesn't, so that's one of them. That's one of the three. My mama doesn't, but go ahead.
Yolanda does.
Yolanda does.
Well, I quote.
I just got my mama on.
I quote the great Crystal West, who says, "Words mean things."
Hello.
And that's just true. The reality, and Maya Angelou talked about this, how nomo, which is the power of the word. And so when you are speaking things out, when you decide what something is, you decide the parameters of what it fits and what does not. And so, we have to be very intentional about the words that we're using and always hopefully being willing to unlearn and relearn and reconstruct things in ways that fit where we are now. Just even thinking about sexual orientation, all the beautiful language young folks have given us about different types of orientations and gender identities and all of that reflects the beauty of sexual diversity in the world. And so language is baked into the cake of...
We're going to get Javontae baking some cakes before the end of this episode. He'll be dropping on Gold Belly very soon.
Getting to it. So, I realize why I love you so much, Tracie. You remind me in many ways of Toni Morrison, right? Because
that's a goal, right? I used to say that I was going to be the Toni Morrison of sex ed.
Because the way you said it, like the beautiful language that young people have given us, right? Like people don't think of language being beautiful that young people have given us,
but it is.
It is, and I don't disagree. But I also think to call a thing. A thing, right? And to really rein it in, because there's so much of our language around HIV and AIDS that is stigmatizing.
Oh, sure. Right. And of course, that speaks to the ways that language can be used adversely, right? We know that and we see it now in our news with current events. People use language to oppress people, right? We use different terms to decide who gets access and who doesn't, or whose lives are worthy and whose aren't. But we also know that right up against that is a culture of resistance that's rooted in language just as well. And it's like, okay, if you're going to take this term, we'll take that term and use it something different. And you talked about the nigga, right? Like, I know a whole lot of niggas, and they don't use that word the same way when they say nigga, right? And so there's also the ways that we can take power back, and decide for ourselves what it is that the world that we're actually going to create. So
the world that we're actually going to create.
Well, as my good girlfriend said, if you can't go to Bella Noche's, where
the hell could you go?
This has been another Javontae. Like, and
keeping us honest with the time. All right,
I'm on time, and I still have seconds to go. I just want to say, Dr. Tracie, Caitlin, Javontae, thank you for moving your time. Thank you all for moving your time. This has been a special presentation for Philly Keep on Loving. And remember, if you can't, Javontae, won't you start your part? I was trying to beat the clock.
You the one just grabbed the mic. You said,
and I loved it. I claim your time.
First of all, the podcast is not Philly Keep on Loving. I don't know how many times we're gonna stumble over that. Second of all, it's a collaboration with both of us.
Jesus.
So let's wrap this up the right way.
Okay.
Remember to wrap it up the right way. That's a 90s plug, right? Anyway.
Speaking of old prevention messages.
Speaking of old prevention.
Right.
So this has been a wonderful conversation. You were very right about that. And we want to tell our viewers, no matter how you're loving,
just keep on loving and use condoms, use protection. Happy World AIDS Day. Live your best life. Just make sure that you live your right life.
Call your mama.
I gotta call my
and wash your
mama.
hands.